The silence in Richard Hawthorne's mansion wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Beverly Hills estate, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom he no longer wanted to rule. The weight of 43 years pressed against his shoulders, each decision he'd made as CEO of Hawthorne Media carved into the lines around his eyes. The house felt enormous around him. 22 rooms, each one echoing with the absence of warmth he'd traded for power. His wife Miranda's laughter used to fill these halls, back when she believed his promises about family time. Now she attended charity galas alone, while their 16-year-old twins, Alex and Emma, lived like strangers under his roof. Richard's phone buzzed incessantly on the mahogany desk behind him. Board meetings, acquisition deals, stock reports. Numbers that defined his worth to the world, but meant nothing when he came home to this marble mausoleum. He pressed his palm against the cold glass. Beyond the manicured gardens, beyond the iron gates, real families were having dinner together, talking, laughing, living lives that didn't require quarterly projections and shareholder meetings. A soft sound made him turn. Maria Santos, his housekeeper of 8 years, moved through the room like a ghost. Her cloth whispered against furniture as she worked, never meeting his eyes, never speaking unless spoken to. She cleaned around him as if he were another piece of furniture, valuable but lifeless. Richard watched her careful movements. 45 years old, maybe older, always dressed in simple clothes, hair pulled back, movements efficient and invisible. He realized with sudden shame that he knew more about his stock portfolio than about the woman who maintained his home. She paused near his desk, dusting the frame containing a photo of his family from 3 years ago. The last time they'd all smiled together. Maria's fingers lingered on the glass for just a moment, so briefly he might have imagined it. When had he become this man? When had success become a cage with golden bars? The phone rang again. Richard didn't move to answer it. For the first time in years, the numbers could wait. The guilt lived in Richard's chest like a stone he couldn't cough up. He sat in his home office at 3 in the morning, staring at documents that blurred together. Revenue projections, audience manipulation reports, the kind of numbers that made shareholders rich and viewers into products. Each page reminded him of promises he'd broken to himself, promises about integrity, about truth, about being different from his father. The house creaked around him, settling into the kind of quiet that made thoughts too loud. Somewhere above, Miranda slept alone in their California king bed. The twins had stopped saying goodnight months ago. Richard rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar ache that had become his constant companion. Success was supposed to feel different. At 25, building Hawthorne Media from nothing, he'd imagined triumph would taste sweeter. Instead, it tasted like iron and regret. A movement in the hallway caught his peripheral vision. Maria appeared briefly in the doorway, a shadow carrying cleaning supplies. She froze when she saw him, eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hawthorne. I didn't know." "It's fine." His voice came out rougher than intended. "Continue." She hesitated, then moved past him to empty the wastebasket beside his desk. Her movements were careful, practiced, professional distance maintained like armor. Richard found himself studying her face for the first time in years. Tired lines around her eyes, but something else, a wariness that went deeper than exhaustion, as if she carried her own stone of guilt. "Maria." The name felt foreign on his tongue. "How long have you worked here?" She paused, cloth halfway to the bookshelf. 8 years, sir." 8 years of watching his family disintegrate. 8 years of cleaning up after their silences and arguments. What had she witnessed that she'd never spoken about? "Do you—" he started, then stopped. The question felt too intimate, too human for the space between employer and employee they'd carefully maintained. She waited, but he couldn't find the words. How do you ask someone if they think you're a good man when you're not sure you want to know the answer? Maria finished her work and moved toward the door. leaving behind only the faint scent of lemon cleaner and something else. Something that reminded him of his childhood, before ambition had consumed everything soft in his life. Richard's choices had become a prison he'd built brick by brick. He stood in the executive bathroom staring at his reflection in Italian marble. The man looking back wore a $1,000 suit but had hollow eyes. 43 years old, and he felt ancient. The empire he'd built demanded sacrifices, his marriage, his children's respect, pieces of his soul traded for market dominance. Outside his office window, the city hummed with life while he orchestrated stories that shaped what millions believed. The responsibility felt heavier each day. Every news segment, every entertainment program carried his fingerprints. He'd convinced himself it was influence, but lately it felt like manipulation. His assistant knocked, announcing another crisis that required his immediate attention. Stock prices, advertiser concerns, government regulatory pressure. Each problem demanded he become more calculating, more ruthless. The good man he'd once been seemed like someone he'd read about in a book. The irony wasn't lost on him. He controlled narrative for a living, but had lost control of his own story. At home that evening, dinner passed in familiar silence. Miranda discussed charity events he wouldn't attend. The twins exchanged glances that excluded him completely. The dining room felt cavernous, designed for a family that existed only in architectural plans. Maria served their meal with quiet efficiency, her presence so practiced it was almost invisible. But Richard noticed things now. The way she anticipated Miranda's needs, how she moved carefully around the twins' teenage moodiness. She navigated their family dynamics like a translator fluent in their particular language of dysfunction. After dinner, he found himself lingering in the kitchen doorway, watching her clean. Her movements were methodical, almost meditative. There was something peaceful about her routine that his high-stakes world lacked entirely. She sensed his presence and looked up. For a moment, their eyes met across the marble island. Something passed between them, not understanding exactly, but recognition. Two people carrying burdens they couldn't share. "Good night, Mr. Hawthorne," she said softly. "Good night, Maria." The words felt like a small crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Not much, but enough to let in a sliver of something he'd almost forgotten existed. The possibility that he wasn't entirely alone. The phone call changed everything in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Richard had returned home early from a board meeting, exhaustion weighing him down like lead. The house was supposed to be empty, Miranda at her yoga class, the twins at school. He climbed the stairs toward his office, already dreading the stack of contracts waiting for his signature. The sound stopped him cold. A woman's voice, barely above a whisper, speaking rapid Portuguese from behind his office door. Fear colored every word, even in a language he didn't understand. Richard pushed the door open and froze. Maria stood at his desk, his personal phone pressed to her ear with trembling hands. Her face was pale, eyes wide with terror he'd never seen before. "Não diz nada," she whispered into the phone. "Eles estão ouvindo." She looked up and saw him. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the mahogany surface. For a moment, neither of them moved. She stood there like a deer caught in headlights, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "Maria!" His voice came out sharper than intended. "What are you doing?" Her mouth opened, but no words came. She looked at the phone, then back at him, and he saw something that made his stomach drop, genuine terror. I'm sorry, Mr. Hawthorne, I can explain." But she couldn't seem to find the words. Her hands shook as she stepped away from his desk, putting distance between herself and the phone, as if it were a weapon. Richard moved closer, studying her face. This wasn't guilt over using his personal line. This was fear. Raw, bone-deep fear that made her look fragile in a way he'd never noticed before. "Who were you talking to?" She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture that made her seem smaller. Someone called me. On your phone. They knew things. About your family, about—" She stopped, biting her lip hard enough to draw blood. "About what, Maria?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with secrets. Outside, Beverly Hills continued its perfect routine. Gardeners trimming hedges, luxury cars gliding past gates. But inside this room, something had shifted irrevocably. Maria's eyes met his, and he saw a woman who had been invisible for 8 years, suddenly thrust into a light that burned. The days that followed moved like walking through quicksand, every step deliberate, dangerous. Richard found himself studying Maria's face across rooms, searching for clues in the careful way she moved through the house. She cleaned with the same efficiency as always, but something fundamental had changed. Her invisibility had been shattered, and now he saw her everywhere, the woman who knew something about his family that terrified her into silence. She wouldn't meet his eyes. When he entered a room, she found reasons to leave. The comfortable distance they'd maintained for 8 years had become a chasm filled with unspoken fears. On the 3rd day, he cornered her in the laundry room. The space was small, intimate in a way that made conversation unavoidable. She stood with her back to him, folding towels with mechanical precision. "Maria, we need to talk." Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. "I have work to finish, Mr. Hawthorne." "The work can wait." His voice was gentler than his usual executive tone. "What you told me about that phone call, I told you nothing." The words came out sharp, defensive. He stepped closer, and she finally turned. Up close, he could see the sleepless nights etched under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the towel. "Someone threatened you. On my phone. In this house." Richard kept his voice low, conscious that walls might indeed have ears. "I need to know what they said." Maria's composure cracked for just a moment. Her lip quivered before she caught herself. They said they know about documents." "About things I've seen." "What documents?" She shook her head quickly, fear winning over trust. "I can't. If I tell you, they'll know. They're watching." The word watching sent a chill down Richard's spine. His house had always been his sanctuary, the one place where the outside world couldn't reach him. Now it felt contaminated, invaded by unseen eyes. "Maria!" He reached out slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Whatever you've seen, whatever you know, you're not alone in this." For the first time since that day in his office, she looked directly at him. Really looked. And Richard saw something that made his chest tighten. Hope, fragile and desperate, fighting against fear. Trust, Richard discovered, could be built one careful gesture at a time. He began leaving Maria handwritten notes. Nothing dramatic, just practical communications that didn't require them to speak aloud. Coffee in the kitchen office at 2 p.m. or front gate repair scheduled Tuesday. Small accommodations that acknowledged her fear of being overheard. She responded in kind. Her notes appeared in places only he would look, tucked under his keyboard, slipped between pages of reports. Her handwriting was careful, precise, documents hidden months ago. Didn't know importance then. And later, "Someone knows I have them." The house developed a strange new rhythm. Miranda noticed nothing, absorbed in her social calendar. Alex and Emma moved through their teenage worlds, earbuds blocking out family dysfunction. But Richard and Maria had begun a silent dance of communication that felt more intimate than most conversations he'd had in years. On Friday evening, Miranda announced she was taking the twins to her sister's place in Malibu for the weekend. "Family bonding," she said, though her tone suggested obligation rather than enthusiasm. After their car disappeared through the gates, the mansion settled into profound quiet. Richard found Maria in the kitchen, preparing to leave for her own weekend. "Stay," he said simply. She froze, one hand on her purse. "Mr. Hawthorne, just for an hour. We need to talk properly." He gestured toward the breakfast nook, away from the formal dining room with its vaulted ceilings and echo. "Please." Maria set down her purse, but remained standing, wariness etched in every line of her body. "What did you find?" Richard asked quietly. "What documents?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Audience reports. From 6 months ago. With changes. Real numbers crossed out. Replaced with higher ones." She met his eyes. "I was cleaning your brother-in-law's home office. I saw them in his briefcase." The words hit Richard like ice water. David, Miranda's brother, the company's legal counsel, the man he'd trusted with his most sensitive business affairs. "You're certain?" Maria nodded. "I took pictures with my phone. I thought, maybe I was wrong, but then the calls started." Richard felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Audience manipulation wasn't just unethical, it was federal fraud. The kind of crime that could destroy everything he'd built. The revelation about David split Richard's world into before and after. He spent the weekend alone in his mansion, pacing halls that now felt like crime scenes. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every moment of trust he'd shared with David replayed in his mind with new, sinister context. His brother-in-law hadn't just betrayed the company. He'd betrayed Richard's faith in family itself. The rational part of his mind calculated damage control. Report David to authorities, distance the company from any wrongdoing, protect shareholders, preserve stock value. It was textbook crisis management, the kind of cold strategy that had built his empire. But the human part of him, the part that had been dormant for too long, saw Maria's terrified face. Saw a woman who had stumbled into his family's corruption and was now paying the price for her accidental knowledge. Monday morning brought David to the office, coffee in hand, discussing legal strategies with casual familiarity. Richard watched his brother-in-law across the conference table and felt nauseous. How long had David been planning this? How deep did the betrayal run? "You're quiet today," David noted, sorting through contracts. "Everything all right?" "Fine." The lie tasted bitter. "Just thinking about quarterly projections." David smiled, the same warm smile that had welcomed Richard into Miranda's family 15 years ago. "Always the numbers man. That's why the company's so successful." The irony was suffocating. Richard excused himself and retreated to his office, closing the door against the weight of everything he thought he knew. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "The housekeeper is becoming a problem." Richard's blood turned cold. They were watching. They knew about his conversations with Maria. Another message appeared. "Handle it, or we will." His hands shook as he deleted the texts. The corporate world had taught him to think strategically, to weigh options like chess moves. But this wasn't about market share or profit margins. This was about a woman who had trusted him with her fear, and the choice between protecting his family's reputation or protecting her life. The equation was simple, but the answer felt impossible. System versus humanity. Empire versus conscience. For the first time in decades, Richard Hawthorne didn't know which man he wanted to be. Maria's shame was a living thing that followed her through the mansion's pristine rooms. She had never intended to occupy space that wasn't meant for her. For 8 years, she had perfected the art of invisibility, cleaning around conversations, moving through hallways like a whisper, existing in the margins of the Hawthorne family's privileged world. Now she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her skin crawl. Every glance from Richard carried weight she didn't know how to interpret. Every moment in his presence felt like trespassing on territory she had no right to enter. The threatening calls had stopped, but the silence felt worse. It meant they were planning, waiting, watching her every move through eyes she couldn't see. She found herself checking locks twice, avoiding windows, jumping at shadows. The mansion that had been her workplace for nearly a decade now felt like a trap. But leaving would mean abandoning the family, and despite everything, the Hawthornes had become her family even if they didn't know it. Maria had watched Miranda struggle through postpartum depression after the twins' birth. had quietly cleaned up after Alex's first heartbreak, finding tear-stained pillows and discarded love letters. Had witnessed Emma's eating struggles, noting the untouched meals and buying different foods without being asked. These people had never seen her as family, but she had claimed them as hers in the quiet way of those who love from the margins. Tuesday afternoon, she discovered something that made her blood freeze. While cleaning David's jacket, he'd left it hanging in the guest room after Sunday dinner, she found a small recording device tucked into the inner pocket. Her hands shook as she held the tiny piece of technology. How long had he been recording family conversations? What had he captured in those intimate moments when the Hawthorns thought they were safe in their own home? She thought about Richard's kindness over the past week, his careful attempts to make her feel protected. He was trying to save her, but he didn't understand the scope of what they were facing. Maria slipped the device into her apron pocket. Evidence. Proof of David's betrayal that could protect the family she'd chosen to love, even if loving them meant sacrificing her own safety. For the first time since the phone calls began, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt purpose. The choice came down to a moment that lasted forever. Richard sat in his office at midnight, staring at his computer screen. David's resignation letter was half-written, a carefully worded document that would remove his brother-in-law from the company while preserving family relationships. It was the safe choice, the strategic choice, the kind of calculated move that had built his empire. But Maria's recording device lay on his desk like an accusation. She had slipped it to him during dinner, her fingers trembling as she pressed the small device into his palm under cover of clearing dishes. The trust in that gesture, a woman risking everything to protect his family, had broken something open in his chest. The device contained hours of David's conversation, plans to discredit Richard, strategies to manipulate board members, threats against Maria disguised as casual suggestions. Each recording was another nail in the coffin of everything Richard had believed about family loyalty. His phone buzzed. Miranda, texting from their bedroom. "David wants to bring the twins to his place in Aspen next weekend. Should I say yes?" Richard's blood ran cold. Getting the twins away from the house, away from potential witnesses. David was escalating, moving pieces into position for whatever endgame he'd planned. The resignation letter cursor blinked, waiting. Richard could still choose the quiet path. Force David out, destroy the evidence, protect the company's reputation. Maria would disappear back into invisibility, and his world would return to its carefully controlled order. But he thought about Alex and Emma, his children who barely knew him because he'd spent their lives choosing empire over family. He thought about Miranda, still believing her brother was trustworthy. He thought about Maria, who had worked for 8 years without being truly seen, now risking her life to protect people who had never protected her. Richard deleted the resignation letter, opened a new document, began typing an email to federal investigators. The words felt like jumping off a cliff, but for the first time in years, he was choosing to fall toward something instead of away from it. He was choosing people over numbers, truth over strategy, the man he used to be over the one he'd become. Outside his window, Beverly Hills slept peacefully, unaware that in one mansion, a media mogul had just decided to destroy his own kingdom to save the people he loved. The FBI arrived at dawn like a surgical strike against everything Richard had built. Agent Sarah Chen stood in his marble foyer, her presence transforming the mansion from sanctuary to crime scene. Behind her, forensics teams moved through rooms that had hosted charity galas and family dinners, now searching for evidence of corporate fraud. "Mr. Hawthorne," Agent Chen's voice was professional, neutral. "We appreciate your cooperation in this matter." Richard nodded, watching strangers catalogue his life. The decision felt surreal. After decades of protecting his empire, he had voluntarily handed over the keys to its destruction. Maria appeared in the doorway, carrying coffee for the agents. Her movements were careful, respectful, but Richard noticed something new in her posture. She stood straighter, met people's eyes. The shame that had bent her shoulders for weeks was transforming into quiet dignity. "Ma'am," Agent Chen addressed her directly, "we'll need to interview you about the evidence you discovered." For the first time in 8 years, someone in the house was speaking to Maria as if her words mattered. She nodded, setting down the tray with steady hands. "Of course. I want to help." Miranda arrived home from her morning yoga class to find federal agents in her kitchen. The color drained from her face as Richard explained David's betrayal, the recordings, the audience manipulation that could destroy everything they'd built. "My brother," her voice broke on the words. "David wouldn't. He loves this family." Richard handed her one of David's recorded conversations, the one where he discussed neutralizing the housekeeper problem and removing obstacles to succession. Miranda's hands shook as she listened to her brother plotting against her husband, her children. The twins returned from school to find their world inverted. Federal agents in their home, their uncle's name spoken like a curse. Their father transformed from distant executive into someone fighting to protect them. "Dad?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain. She hadn't called him that in months. Richard looked at his daughter, really looked, and saw fear mixed with something unexpected, hope. As if watching him choose family over empire had reminded her that he was more than just a man in suits who missed dinner. "We're going to be okay," he told her, and meant it. All of us. The corporate machine he'd spent decades building was crumbling, but something stronger was taking its place. A family that saw each other, finally. A home where Maria belonged instead of just worked. Revolution, Richard realized, sometimes began with choosing love over logic. The transformation came in waves, each one reshaping the landscape of their lives. 3 weeks after the FBI raid, Hawthorne Media was hemorrhaging. Stock prices plummeted. Advertisers fled. The board called emergency meetings that Richard attended like a man walking to his own execution. Every decision he'd made, choosing truth over strategy, people over profit, was being tested in the crucible of consequence. But inside the mansion, something unprecedented was happening. The family was talking. Miranda found Maria in the garden one afternoon, both women sitting quietly among the roses. It was the first time in 8 years they had shared the same space without the pretense of employer and employee. "I'm sorry," Miranda said quietly, "for not seeing you. Really seeing you." Maria's response was gentle, without bitterness. "You were protecting yourself. I understand." They talked about David's betrayal, about Miranda's childhood with a brother she'd thought she knew, about the loneliness of living in a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. For the first time, Miranda understood that Maria had been witnessing their family's pain from the margins, caring for them in ways they'd never acknowledged. The twins began appearing in the kitchen during Maria's cooking hours. Alex helped translate when she called her daughter in Brazil. Emma sat at the counter doing homework, asking questions about Maria's life before Beverly Hills. These moments, casual, unforced, felt more valuable than any corporate acquisition Richard had ever orchestrated. But the outside pressure was relentless. David's arrest made national news. Media mogul's empire crumbles in fraud scandal dominated headlines. Lawyers circled like vultures, calculating damages, preparing lawsuits. Richard's assistant quit. Half the executive team resigned. The company he'd spent his life building was disintegrating in real time, and every collapse felt like vindication for choosing humanity over empire. Late one evening, he found Maria organizing family photos in the living room. Pictures that had been gathering dust in storage, memories relegated to closets while they lived like strangers under the same roof. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I want to." She held up a photo of the twins as toddlers, laughing in a pile of autumn leaves. But Maria had captured something he'd missed. His children's joy, Miranda's genuine smile, the possibility of happiness he'd been too busy to notice. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying weight beyond photo organization. They were rebuilding, piece by piece, into something real. The courtroom became the stage where everything Richard had built would either survive or die completely. David sat across the aisle with his legal team, no longer the warm brother-in-law who had shared. Family holidays. Families should remember the good times. Richard studied the picture, remembering that day. He'd been stressed about a merger, barely present for the moment. His eyes were cold, calculating. The real David that Maria had glimpsed in those terrifying phone calls months ago. Richard watched Maria take the witness stand with quiet dignity. She wore a simple blue dress that Miranda had insisted on buying for her, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. For 8 years, she had been invisible in their world. Now she was the most important person in the room. "Please state your name for the record." "Maria Santos." Her voice was clear, steady. The prosecutor guided her through the discovery of the documents, the threatening phone calls, the recording device in David's jacket. Each answer was precise, honest, devastating to the defense. David's lawyer tried to discredit her, questioning her motives, her legal status, her right to be in the Hawthorne home in the first place. The attacks were brutal, designed to make her seem like an opportunistic outsider who had manipulated her way into their family secrets. But something remarkable happened. Miranda stood up from the gallery. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "I need to say something." The judge allowed it. Miranda walked to the witness area, not to testify, but to stand beside Maria, literally and figuratively. "Maria Santos has been part of our family for 8 years. She has cared for my children, protected our home, and kept our secrets with more loyalty than my own blood." Miranda's voice broke slightly. "She is not an outsider. She is family." The gesture rippled through the courtroom. Alex and Emma exchanged glances, then stood as well. Richard felt his throat tighten as he watched his children, who had learned to see Maria as family through their parents' transformation, offer their own silent support. The jury noticed. You could see it in their faces, the recognition that this wasn't about corporate fraud anymore. This was about a woman who had risked everything to protect people she loved, and a family who had finally learned to love her back. David's conviction came 3 hours later, guilty on all counts. But the real verdict had been delivered earlier, when a family chose to protect someone who had always protected them. When love proved stronger than blood, and belonging became a choice rather than an accident of birth. Walking out of the courthouse, Richard realized they had won something more valuable than any legal victory. They had won each other. 6 months after the trial, the Hawthorne mansion felt like a completely different place. The corporate empire was gone. Hawthorne Media sold to competitors, assets liquidated to pay legal fees and settlements. But the family that remained was richer in ways Richard had never imagined possible when he'd measured wealth only in stock prices and market share. Maria no longer cleaned the house alone. Alex helped with laundry while practicing Spanish phrases she taught him. Emma cooked Brazilian recipes that filled the kitchen with unfamiliar spices and laughter. Miranda had discovered that Maria was an excellent gardener, and they spent afternoons redesigning the landscape together. The changes were practical too. Richard had legally formalized Maria's status, not just as an employee, but as family. Immigration lawyers had expedited her path to citizenship. A college fund was established for her daughter Sofia in Brazil, with plans to bring her to California once she finished her studies. "You didn't have to do all this," Maria told him one evening as they reviewed the paperwork. "Yes, I did." Richard's voice was certain. "Family takes care of family." The simplicity of the statement belied how revolutionary it felt. For decades, he had thought family meant biological connections and legal obligations. Now he understood it meant choosing to love people who chose to love you back. The mansion itself was being transformed too. Walls were coming down, literally and figuratively. The formal dining room became a family room where homework happened alongside work calls. Maria's quarters were expanded into a proper suite. The kitchen island was extended to accommodate larger family dinners that now included Sophia via video calls from São Paulo. Richard's new business was smaller, more personal, a media consultancy that prioritized truth over profit. The work was fulfilling in ways his empire never had been. He helped independent journalists, supported community media, used his experience to build rather than exploit. Some nights, he found the whole family gathered in the living room, not because of scheduled family time, but because they genuinely wanted each other's company. Miranda reading, the twins doing homework, Maria teaching them Portuguese phrases, Richard reviewing contracts that actually meant something. These moments felt like miracles, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary, the kind of ordinary that money couldn't buy, but love could build. The man who had once controlled narratives for millions had finally learned the most important story was the one happening in his own home. 1 year later, Richard stood in the same spot where his story had begun, at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Beverly Hills mansion, looking out at the city below. But everything had changed. The house hummed with life now. Maria's daughter Sophia had arrived from Brazil the week before, her nervous excitement filling the halls with rapid Portuguese and careful English. Emma was teaching her American slang while Alex explained Beverly Hills social dynamics with teenage authority. Miranda emerged from the kitchen carrying a birthday cake. Today marked the anniversary of the day Maria had been caught with the phone, the day their real family had begun. It had become their unofficial family holiday, celebrated not as the day crisis struck, but as the day they chose each other. "Ready?" Miranda called out. They gathered in the dining room that was no longer formal, no longer silent. Sophia sat between the twins, already comfortable in a way that spoke to Maria's gift for creating belonging wherever she went. Maria wore the simple gold necklace Richard had given her, not as an employer giving a bonus, but as a father figure welcoming a daughter home. "Speech!" Emma demanded, grinning at Richard. He looked around the table at faces that had become his whole world. The corporate empire he'd spent decades building was gone, but what remained was infinitely more valuable. "A year ago I thought family meant blood and obligation," he began. "I thought love was something you fell into by accident and maintained through duty." Maria smiled, her eyes bright with tears that weren't sad. But Maria taught us something different. She taught us that family is a choice you make every day, that love is something you build through small acts of seeing each other, protecting each other, choosing each other when it's hard. Sophia whispered a translation to herself, learning the language of her new family. "We lost an empire," Richard continued, his voice steady with conviction, "but we found something worth so much more. We found home." The applause was gentle, warm. Not the polite clapping of corporate dinners, but the organic celebration of people who genuinely loved being together. Later that night, Richard found himself back at the window. But instead of feeling trapped by golden bars, he felt expansive. The city stretched below him, not a kingdom to control, but a community to serve. Behind him, laughter drifted from the kitchen where Maria was teaching Sophia and the twins to make brigadeiros. Miranda was on the phone with her lawyer, finalizing adoption papers that would make their chosen family official. The silence that had once suffocated him was gone, replaced by the beautiful noise of a house full of people who belonged to each other. Richard smiled, finally understanding what success really meant.